Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here and lovely to be amongst friends and friends in Christ. There's such a special togetherness that we have. Can we start with a little prayer? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom. Thank you. Well, to begin with, in my talk, I'm going to actually be talking about two topics. They're not unrelated. One's more psychological and the other one will be spiritual adoption of the unborn child, but there is a link. Let me begin by saying that it's not uncommon for conservative Catholics in the field of psychology, especially to denigrate the field of psychology, especially counselling psychology, and to state that it's un-Catholic. I have heard the following question: what are 1,000 psychologists at the bottom of the sea? Answer: a good start. But the psychologists say it about lawyers, and lawyers say it about taxation accountants. However, it may come as a surprise to you, and it's very controversial as an issue for conservative Catholics and for what you'd say secular Catholics, that psychology has long been a Catholic profession. At least it's always used the Catholic legacy of philosophy and theology. There's been a theological anthropology at the heart of it. Now this is a very controversial point, and believe me, I've been through the whole gamut of secular training until I got to the John Paul II, which was like a haven, but you will never hear this. Consider the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1913. There's this Orthodox edition, which you might expect to condemn psychology, but it in fact praises it. It reminds the reader that the growth of psychology was always indebted to Catholic philosophy and theology. It says, to Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas, the popularisation of the psychology of Aristotle throughout Europe during the 13th century was mainly due. It mentions the actual parts of the Summa, where St. Thomas gives a fairly complete and systematic account of leading topics connected with psychology. It says, questions of biology, general metaphysics and theology were constantly interwoven with psychology for many centuries, and liberal use was made of physiological evidence in psychological discussions. Of course, that understanding of psychology is largely a pre-19th century one, but it's also facing the huge explosion in development in the 19th century. What happened is there was a growth in understanding of the brain functions, the nervous system, physiology in general, all throughout the 19th century. And so the encyclopedia entry that I mentioned says now psychology deals with the phenomena of the mind, the processes and the states of human consciousness as well. It didn't get rid of the other basis, philosophically and theologically. So these advances in the understanding of the brain were actually a marvellous thing. For the first time, people started to get a handle on what happens in diseases such as schizophrenia, in bipolar disorder. Nobody knew before it was due to a biochemical imbalance, a deficiency in the body. It was a good thing that medication was given to alleviate the distress of so many people. One of the physiologists of the 19th century, Johannes Müller, 1801 to 1858, was a devout Catholic, and he saw his profession in psychology as well, and he said he never saw his faith in conflict with his work in psychology. Even Protestant historians of the 20th century acknowledge the great debt to Catholic psychologists in the 19th century. Eric Johnston and Stanton Jones, in a book called Christianity and Psychology, published in 2000, say that the most distinct group of Christians in early modern psychology, especially in America, was Catholic, saying that Catholics were the first identifiable Christians who sought to provide texts that supplemented the literature of empirically based psychology with religiously grounded discussion on the person and the soul. They mention Father Edward Aloysius Pace, Father Werner Moore, Belgian Cardinal Désiré Mercier. Now, if you haven't heard of some of these people, I'm sure you've heard of Cardinal Mercier, but if you haven't heard of these other priest psychologists, it's because that is never included in the history and outline of psychology. I found out after I had studied for many years at uni through going to search for it. It's very, very incorrect. There's a kind of a nomenclatura at present that doesn't permit this. Now, the very beginning of modern psychology, just to put it in perspective, was 1879. There was a German professor, a little bit eccentric, with glasses and a white coat, who said, "Why is this so?" and had his laboratory, and he started to do a whole lot of experiments. He had a metronome and he'd say, "What do you feel between the tick and the tock?" And his room was filled to capacity. There were people out on the streets waiting to hear what he was going to say about sensation, consciousness, and all the related matters. One of the people who became totally entranced with him and his new field of psychology, because it was so empirical, was Father Edward Aloysius Pace, a wonderful American priest. Father Pace was a very learned Thomist. He disputed brilliantly before Pope Leo XIII on very troublesome questions in scholastic philosophy. And in 1889, on his way back to America, he stopped at a second-hand bookshop in Paris. And he was going through these books and he found William Wundt's book on psychology recently published, and he dashed to Leipzig, joined this German professor in the white coat and said, "I'm so pleased to meet you." And can you imagine what that German professor said to him? He was a Protestant, William Wundt. He said, "Aha, so you know about the Pope's latest encyclical Aeterni Patris." And then this Protestant proceeded to discuss Thomistic issues with this Catholic priest. That's what psychology was like in the 19th century. Then there was Cardinal Désiré Mercier, who started the first psychology department outside of Leipzig at Louvain. Father Pace couldn't wait to get back to America. He set up the first psychological department in the Catholic University of America. He taught a very interesting man called Father Werner Moore, who was a medical doctor who then became a psychologist. He helped a lot of children with disabilities, and he established the first psychology clinic, like a clinical psychology practice. And he contributed so much to the knowledge of psychology that he used to go to conferences, but then he decided to become a priest, and then he became a monk, and then he withdrew entirely and became a Carthusian monk. But even from his Carthusian retreat, apparently his superior encouraged him to write papers on psychology, and he sent them to be read in absentia. A most remarkable man, but he thought highly of psychology. So what's the problem? Why do people say, "Oh, psychologists, what do they know?" In simple terms, it was what we have been hearing about all our lives. It was that retreat from the transcendent which started and gained force throughout the 19th century. You had people like Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, Darwin, who all in their various ways established this idea that life can be lived without God. Etsi Deus non daretur. In a book called Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism, American psychologist Paul Vitz, he's a contemporary, reflected generally on what happened. He said, only as it starts to fade away do we see how strange this modern world has been. It's natural that some distance is needed for the characteristics of the modern to become obvious. And nothing has been more typical of public life than the presumption of atheism. God has been banished from public discourse. The then Cardinal Ratzinger, in 2005, also commented, Europe has developed a culture that has been, in a way, hitherto unknown to humanity. It excludes God from the public consciousness, whether he's totally denied or whether his existence is judged to be indemonstrable and uncertain. And so it's relegated to the domain of subjective choices as something that's irrelevant for public life. So by the time of Freud's publication of the interpretation of dreams in 1900, the Behaviourist Manifesto in 1913, the anti-transcendent tenor had made its way into psychology. Psychology itself was not the problem. It was that enormous wave, you could say almost of anti-God, almost occult wave that has spread, trying to banish God from public discourse. Spiritual quests for meaning, which had always been respected in psychology, somehow became relegated to the sidelines. Freud, a secular Jew, refused to allow his very orthodox Jewish wife to practice her faith. And the behaviourists went even one step further. They said, don't even have a spiritual quest. They said, you don't even have an internal life. So introspection doesn't even exist. The joke between two behaviourists is when they meet, because they can never tell you how they feel because they don't have an internal life, so they say, two behaviourist psychologists meet in the corridor, one says to another, hello, you're well, how am I? Because it can only be done by observation. But in the rejection of this transcendent came a person who was going to be the saviour and bring back the person, potential and everything back into psychology. Imagine Carl Rogers, lovely, unctuous sounding voice, kind, and he with his colleagues, Rollo May, Eric Fromm, Abraham Maslow among them, said the person is unique, full of potential, capable of greater things. And everybody loved it after the tragic pessimism of Freud, who said, you just have to accept your fate, you know, according to the Oedipus story. People wanted to hear something more positive. And so when he wrote his book on becoming a person, people just thought he had rescued psychology from these terrible doldrums at the beginning of the century. Psychologist James Bugental said, humanistic psychology, and listen, this is a psychologist said this, has an ultimate concern with the dignity and the worth of man and an interest in the development of the potential inherent in every person. It could have come from a papal encyclical. Isn't it beautiful? It seemed religious, but was it? Was it religious? Well, actually, it was. It was. Paul Vitz and William Kilpatrick pointed out in their excellent critique that yes, Rogers was very religious, but not in the sense that we understand. Rogers actually invented a new religion, a philosophy, an all-embracing faith that had the notion of salvation, an attainment to higher development without God. And he extolled the person so much in a post-Auschwitz world, in a post-World War II context. People wanted to hear this. after hearing that human beings were capable of murdering millions. The word genocide was coined in World War II. After hearing about the gulags, who didn't want to hear that human beings were really basically deep down and nice? There was a change anyway. I mean, I'm okay, you're okay, Saddam Hussein's okay, we're all okay. But some psychologists smelt a rat. Very few. William Oden, a Protestant, was one of them, and he said this is a recasting of Christian theology in a psychotherapy. Did Rogers do away with sin? Well, he did away with the word, but he didn't do away with the concept. He just invented his own version of it. You get into sin by being too influenced by your culture and by other people's values. You have to invent them for yourself. You have to get to the stage of empathy, congruence, unconditional positive regard. Now, this actually swept through the Catholic world. Catholics loved it in America. They succumbed to this quasi-Marxist view of the world. Why do I say Marxist? Because it was very like the liberation theology. You create the kingdom of man on earth. And they thought it was a chance to escape sex-obsessed Freud. And basically, it was a lot cheaper than psychotherapy because you could go and do encounter groups and they didn't cost very much. Yeah. So Catholic intellectuals in the 60s and 70s were deeply attracted to third force psychology because it offered this alternative. William Coulson at the time, who you may have heard of, said, "We did programs for the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Sisters of Providence, the Sisters of Charity and the Mercy Sisters. We did dozens of Catholic institutions, organisations, because as you recall, in the excitement following Vatican II, everyone wanted to update, renew, and we offered them a way to renew without bothering to study. We said, look within." At the same time, in a beautiful historical irony, there was a man in Eastern Europe called Father Karol Wojtyła. And guess what? He was also teaching psychology, philosophical psychology to his students at the same time that Carl Rogers was wowing the West. Father Karol Wojtyła, who had seen Nazi tyranny and seen all his professors arrested, knew that he had to speak in a new language of suffering in this post-Auschwitz world. Actually spoke of the dignity of the human person, but he never separated from the metaphysics, the idea that the human person is created in the image of God. And also he had something to say about suffering, the traditional notion that not one tear ever escapes God's attention, that suffering, unique in Catholicism, acquires a tremendous value. So meanwhile, Rogers was wowing everybody in the, you know about the Immaculate Heart of Mary Convent in Hollywood and how he went there. And because he had a friend, William Coulson, a Catholic psychologist, who exploited his relationship with one of the nuns in the convent. So he got an invitation for Carl Rogers to come in. And he says, as a Catholic, I was assigned to exploit the connection. I spoke to the California Conference of Major Superiors of Women Religious and showed them a film of Carl Rogers, so they all went along with us. They trusted us. What's that trust? Trust in experts. Trust in expertise, which Catholics are very prone to do because they have a strong respect for authority. So, while autonomy and self-actualisation became the new principles, the Immaculate Heart of Mary order, which had 600 schools at the time, ended up a year or two later with 59. Basically, I think the majority of the nuns were petitioning to leave, and William Coulson, I think, had a big conversion afterwards and repented of this for the rest of his life. Henri de Lubac commented in The Splendour of the Church that the manner of the humanist attack it came unawares. It wasn't a Soviet army or something attacking us. It was a revolution through beautiful words, the offer of self-actualised human beings. But is this relevant now? Rogers was then, this is now. The answer is yes. very much so. Rogers became the bridge to the New Age and to subjectivism. In fact, he and Abraham Maslow were co-founders of Esalen, the New Age Institute in California, to which many priests went. And if you want to know where the Enneagram came from, it came from Esalen and from this New Age connection. Once you start to realise what actually happened, it is sociologically and historically a quite horrifying journey. So does the church need psychology? Well, yes, it does, but not that kind. It needs to reclaim its authentic Catholic heritage. It needs it because people work in the church. There is a need to assess seminarians, to assess people working in organisations, to deal with problems, and to remember what Gaudium et Spes said, that the truth is, only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. For Adam, the first man, was a figure of him who was to come, namely Christ the Lord. Christ, the final Adam, by his revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. Do you realise that that was the basis of psychology and anthropology? And we missed it. It took 20 to 30 years later to understand that this was the basis of the social sciences, which were desperately needed at the time, because, as then Cardinal Ratzinger said, it's a very profound question of who is man and what is man's relation to transcendence. And the questions will never go away. Who am I? Where have I come from? Why is there evil? What is there after this life? Actually, I'm quoting from the beginning of Fides et Ratio. They're there in Confucius, in Lao Tse, in the Veda, the Tirukhanara, Buddha tries to deal with them. They are the eternal questions. You cannot separate them from psychology. As George Weigel pointed out in Faith, Reason and the War Against Jihadism, Westerners may sideline these questions, as many uniquely do, but other cultures will not. Other cultures take these questions very seriously, even at the cost of destroying the West, if the West does not take them up again. Returning to Gaudium et Spes 22, why should Christ be a model for understanding the human person? You might ask that question just as a simple why. Why is it so? Why do we need models? Well, because when you look at the gamut of history, all throughout history, human beings have an imitative quality. They look at good people, they look at saintly people, and they follow them. Even the communists have their saints. I've been in Red Square. I've seen the kilometre queue to see Lenin's grave, Lenin's tomb. They have the person that they think is the good person. They got it wrong, but every culture has it. So basically, what we're doing is, when we're looking at this imitative quality, we're simply looking at how we are constructed. We're not constructed just to be autonomous units, as Carl Rogers would claim. We're connected to others and to the transcendent. So very few psychologists took note at the time, but Karol Wojtyła was doing it in Eastern Europe, and in as much as he included psychology in his work, which I think he did, and also Catholic psychologists. There was the Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars. Well, here was Paul Witz, there was William Coulson, there was William Kilpatrick, Richard Cross, Christian Brugger, and they were Americans. This really is a case of the Americans came back and rescued and are rescuing psychology. They very much wanted to put that theological anthropology of Pope John Paul II and also Pope Benedict XVI into psychology, to understand how much of a battle it was. Do you know that on the very day that John Paul II was going to announce the establishment of the John Paul II Institutes, which were going to deal with these social issues, it was May the 13th, 1981. That very day he was shot. There was obviously some attempt to prevent this happening, because this would revolutionise the understanding of the human person. Pope John Paul II said, "You can never have freedom or self-actualisation at the expense of truth." We are in a nuptial relationship with the truth. Whether you like it or not, whether you are single, whether you are married, we are already married in the sense of having a spouse on earth. We are in another sense married from our birth. Paul Witt said, the very first thought of a child isn't I. Now there's evidence that it's actually a we. There's a connectedness. We are married not only to the truth, we're in a spousal relationship to it. We're in a spousal relationship to the person who is the truth. And it is all our lives. We can't escape from it. So the Christian comeback is in progress. These ideas are coming back. In Australia, Sister Lydia, a clinical psychologist, and a wonderful clinical psychologist, Mary Ticinovic, who I think is here, smiling. We've had a little group running in Sydney of talking about issues of interest to Catholic psychologists, and I know they do wonderful work in their areas of expertise, and I hope in the future they will be able to speak at these conferences on many issues that I have found fascinating. There's also CAPIG, which is an area of the Australian Psychological Association. Hey, get this. The Australian Psychological Association accepts lesbians and gays as an interest group. They have New Age interest group. Because they're tolerant to all, they have to accept Christians. So they've got a massive Christian interest group. They couldn't reject them, just to stay true to their idea of tolerance. So get that, eh? So I've been to one of their conferences. I'm going to the next one. And there is a very strong group of Protestant Christians who are counselling. They've set up institutes, and so on. Now, when I say Christian counselling, I don't mean that somebody gets out a Bible and just, you go in and say, I'm very depressed, and somebody reads you 3 Bible passages and says, chin up, and off you go. It's not like that. Actually, the American psychologists I mentioned are not for biblical counselling. That may sound a shocking thing, but no, it's not that they're against the Bible. They're against simply saying something without integrating properly the empirical and the good knowledge we have. It is only after you integrate what we know about the functions of the brain, the biochemistry of the person, about the behaviour of the person, about what we know about disordered personalities. You take in the whole gamut, and therefore psychology really is multifaceted, and it is a very interesting balance of going to various areas. I myself have used the spiritual dimension in counselling. I actually have learnt a lot from the children I've counselled. One little boy, 9 years old, lost his mother, who was a heroin addict, was at the school, adopted by his auntie, and he said to me, Miss, have you seen The Passion of the Christ? And I said, no. I said, yes, I have, but I'd love to see it again. And he said, yes. And I said, have you seen it? He said, yes, I think it's a very good film. I think everybody should see it. This is a little Tongan Protestant boy. And he said, at Easter we're going to do Christ walking to Calvary. And he said, and they asked me to be Jesus. And he said, and when I carried the cross, he said, I think I knew how he felt. It came from a 9-year-old child. Another girl I spoke to, her mother had tragically been attacked by her father. She barely survived. The girl, at age 10, prayed for her mother's unborn child, that she wouldn't be injured. Actually, I hesitate to say some of these situations for fear of shocking you too much, but the girl's father shot the mother, and the girl witnessed it. She prayed for that unborn child. The bullet went in, missed everything to do with the child. The child was born safe. I asked this girl, where did she get her strength to deal with this? And she said, Miss, sometimes I think God asks some people to carry more. This is from a child who is a state school, very little catechesis. So children are really open to the transcendent. Now, there are a couple of controversial issues in psychology that really are works in progress. Yesterday, Father Terence Merry spoke very eloquently about the problem of homosexuality, and I'm sure you mentioned the fact that it was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and then wasn't. Actually, I have copies of the article of one of the people who was on the board who included it, who now has recanted and said, I realised I was wrong. So there are these things happening all the time. Also, in the area of post-abortion grief, we have people on the front line telling us that this grief profoundly affects women. It is not a passing experience. I don't know if you know about Anne Lastman in Melbourne. She's the most wonderful counsellor. She has counselled thousands of women in post-abortion grief. Let nobody tell you abortion does not affect women. Here is a first-hand account from Anne. She has spoken in Rome about it. She's spoken around Australia. She is the most eloquent witness to it. In my situation, I found in Poland, and listening to people talking about post-abortion grief, because even in these Orthodox and Catholic countries there was a lot of abortion, that a new movement has started up. And this is where I move a little bit onto the talking about spiritual adoption of the unborn child. Women there can't afford to go to psychologists or counsellors often, especially in the Ukraine. And a lady called Wanda Skowronska has started this spiritual, she didn't start it, I don't know really where it started, she picked it up again and is promoting spiritual adoption of the unborn child. What is that? It's the easiest way to be pro-life in the whole wide world. You don't even have to leave your kitchen, you can sit there and you can still be very pro-life. If of course, I advise you to go to the vigils and go to all the pro-life things, but this way is an adjunct, it's parallel to it. What it is, it's basically, if you say the rosary every day, just take one decade, dedicate one decade to an unborn child, and say a short prayer before that decade, and do it for 9 months. Just wanted to show you the leaflets that have the prayer on it. There's actually a once-off prayer. You say at the beginning, and then every day you just say that short prayer and the decade of the rosary. Now, you may think, oh, that's a very nice pious idea that Wanda has, but is it really true? Well, actually it's spreading, and it has the support of Pope John Paul II and Bishop Porteous. Just in the last few months has given his official approval and support to this movement. It is the most wonderful way of having a relationship with an unborn child. You will have that relationship until you go to eternity. And this is a way of really showing your connections to the unborn, who are the invisible asylum seekers of our time. A priest in Poland who started praying for 9 months, he actually got a bit sick of it. He was a Pauline priest, and he publicly tells his story. He said, look, after 8 months I said, I've had enough. I think this is just a pious fantasy. Catholics can get a bit over the top. And he said, I'm just going to say the straight, normal things and not go on for this sort of stuff. And what happened? That night he had the most amazing dream. Went to sleep, and then he was awoken by a phone call in the morning. Got a rude shock. And he was asked to go immediately to the hospital. The chaplain was sick, and there were many sick people there. The dream that he'd had during the night, to his amazement, was of a big car accident, a man sitting at the side of the road, a woman holding a baby, all were bleeding, and a truck overturned. So he was a bit shaky, had a bit of coffee, walked off onto the street, then went up to the hospital. And lo and behold, the first person he saw in the emergency ward was the man he'd seen in his dream. And he thought, oh, this is a bit strange. And the man said, thank you, Father, for coming. He said, but could you go and see my wife? She was 8 months pregnant. She gave birth to her child after the accident. Please go and see them. The priest, when he went to see the lady, recognised the person he had seen in his dreams. Now, this is a priest speaking. And he said, from that moment, I never doubted that spiritual adoption of the unborn child is real. He said, if you say that prayer every day for 9 months, a child has taken it. Maybe a child from at the abortion clinics for whom they're praying, who is rescued in that way. It is real. And also, in Sydney, a man said he prayed for 9 months and he had a dream suddenly that a child was presented to him through the door. And he woke up in the morning saying to his 65-year-old wife, "Quick, quick to the hospital, my baby, my baby, my baby." And she turned around and said, "What?" And he kind of came to after his dream and he said, "Oh." And then he realised the 9 months was up and he'd had that dream on the very day. Interesting things happen when you take up this apostolate, and those unborn children, they play a very significant role in your life when you take them up. I think this is a big, hidden, undiscovered powerhouse in the communion of saints, that they are somewhere there being for us and interceding for us. As I said, women with post-abortion syndrome can't afford to go to psychologists and psychiatrists in Eastern Europe, so they often will adopt unborn children. This happened recently in the Ukraine. Viesha went and 2,000 people turned up in a church. The priest allowed her to begin, and she spoke about the fact that each child who was aborted, and these are women who, many of whom had had 3, 5, 7, 10 and 1 over 30 abortions. And Viesha said to them, each one of them is God's child. And she said, "I'm here to try to heal you." And she said, but first, before she can go on, the women start crying. And if ever there was a stark reminder of Rachel weeping for her children, the weeping in this church just rises so loudly that people in the town come. Whenever she's there in the Ukraine, it happened to be in Rivno last time, and they were watching and listening. What's this wailing? But she knows from experience this is what happens, and they're very open about it. They're not like we're a bit more Anglo-Saxon and people don't say these things, but they do. And the priest is there saying, "I want to see every woman in confession, and we will, go through this process." And Viesha says, "I want you to name every single child," and she gives them a prayer. And then she says, "Will you consider spiritually adopting an unknown, unborn child?" And the women do this, and this is the miracle, that those unborn children have such a profound psychological and spiritual effect on these women that the majority of them, if not all of them, say that they are healed in the process of spiritual adoption of an unborn child. And this happens by the hundreds, by the thousands, and it's a great testimony to this apostolate. So I have leaflets here if you'd like to take some afterwards, and I've got these are little prayer cards. All you need to do is just kneel down, you say the opening prayer, and then every day say the little prayer. You can put it in your missal. You say this little prayer with a decade of the rosary. Of course you can offer up any fasting or suffering, that's optional, it's not part of it. Anything else you want to do, you can. And when you go to the next world, you will see that somebody may come up to you and say, "Remember me? I made it because you prayed for me." And just to finish, remember that Christ says, the Bible tells us that God is close to the brokenhearted. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Whatever grief one may have, remember that Christ is the one true light. And in Isaiah it says, "Your sun will never set again, your moon will wane no more. The Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of sorrow will end." We are married to the truth, and we're living a great romance, and we will meet in the next world those whom we have loved through this apostolate and through the pro-life movement. Thank you very much. Should I answer questions? Okay.
Thank you, Wanda. She's good. She really is. Now my mind's gone completely blank. We're going to have some questions, and I'm sure that you will have some questions. Wanda, it occurred to me, Wanda has just completed her doctorate on this issue of the Catholic involvement, the Catholic beginnings, origins of psychology, and it's a very good read. But of course, doctoral theses are big chunky things. Wanda, you've got a book coming on.
Oh.
We're okay. Now, does anyone have a question? We have some, yes. We have a roving mic. Thank you. Father Terence.
Thank you, Wanda, on behalf of everyone here about this very elucidating. My question is, given your little solo at the beginning about conservative Catholics, having some sort of antipathy toward psychology and so forth, what is at the moment the present sort of turnaround of psychologists toward a more Christian approach to psychology, given the fact that the Church is sending, as you mentioned, young men off to psychologists and so forth before they enter seminaries?
I think Cardinal Pell in Sydney is, and I'm sure the same as with Archbishop Hart, are very well aware of these issues, and I think that they could probably suss out a Rogerian psychologist a mile off and invite them for a cup of tea and shake their hand and say, see you sometime. I think that they're very aware of getting people who are very attuned to the Catholic dimension. If I can mention Sister Lydia. Sister Lydia has written eloquently on the issue of homosexuality and the Church's understanding of it. This is the new wave coming in. Mary Ticinovic, I know, uses a spiritual dimension in her work. Clinical psychologist John Poon. You ask for numbers. I have to say straight, I really don't know the numbers, but it's increasing. And at the Christianity and Psychology Conference that is held every 2 years, the proportion of Catholics to Protestants would be probably 30 to 40% Catholic, but the majority are Protestants. However, I expect that will grow. Usually there's about 300 at these places. And there are a lot of psychologists in Melbourne, I know, who I've met, marvellous people who are working in clinical practice. But it's just it's not underground ghetto alone anymore. It's getting to be into, sort of a group that's growing stronger, and I anticipate it will grow ever stronger. We don't as yet have a Catholic university teaching psychology. That's the major problem. So, perhaps in the future there may be some bridging course between the secular course and employment in Catholic institutions. I don't know. There's just an idea off the top of my head. But Sister Lydia and Mary and I and John, and we meet with like-minded people and hope to discuss these things further. But yeah, the revolution isn't total yet. So,
Please, Wanda. I'm just wondering how you feel about meditation. I asked the question because somebody came to me. They had taken their child to a psychologist, and she was supposed to be Christian, but she had suggested meditation. Can you elucidate that one?
Yes, you have to be very careful when these terms come up because they sound very good. Actually, that's an example of an appropriation of a very Catholic word now for New Age or for Eastern religious purposes. A bit of a confusion because people think, what harm is there in meditation? Actually, the Christian notion of meditation is very, very different from the Eastern one. The Eastern one says empty your mind, and the Christian one never says empty your mind. It says free yourself of distractions, free yourself of what's unimportant, and then focus on God, focus on Christ. Whereas the Eastern meditation will say empty your mind, and then when you are actually saying a mantra, you're actually inviting the Spirit to come into that empty space. So I would be very careful and wary, even if people use the word Christian around it. I know that sometimes people mean well and they're not informed, but I have heard very tragic stories from innocent involvements, not only with meditation, but with yoga, with Reiki and all of that. And these are Catholics who innocently got involved and had some brushes with occult experiences that were really truly shocking for them. But why not try the Catholic idea of contemplation, meditation? There's a very rich history of it. I'm sure Father Terence Mary will inform everybody of the books to read at the end of this. Ben O'Brien.
Thank you, Dr. Skowronska, for your very educated talk. All this talk from Carl Rogers and people like that about self-actualisation, it sounds like a way of justifying abortion to me. Is this how the psychologists do it?
Actually,
they'll have some abortion businesses have a psychologist on staff.
Well, actually, you've hit on a very deep irony of the time, because at the very time when the person came back into discussion in psychology, Carl Rogers, that was his theme word, the person. That is exactly when the abortion started to rise, when we depersonalised the child in the womb. So very, very strange irony. And then, of course, in the wake of that came all the other horrors, the in vitro fertilisation, the embryonic experimentation, the cloning and the, have some twins, one with a spare with parts, and this sort of thing. But yes, Carl Rogers was for autonomy. He said basically you live for yourself and that's it. And all these psychologists who I've studied, they've gone into the theology of the church, and especially Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, who I think both are very saintly figures and write extremely eloquently on the anthropology of the person. They say we're born into relation and connection with others. And I don't know if she's here today, but Jocelyn Headley spoke very eloquently yesterday about the being with and for, and and to. We're not born and meant to be isolated. Carl Rogers said, if something disturbs you, just get rid of it and go and live your life. Now, he wasn't a hedonist. There's actually a name for the kind of autonomous belief that he had. There's a philosophical tradition of it called ethical egoism. And it's the promotion of non-moral goods. It's knowledge and power. The heresies at the basis of Carl Rogers's ideas were Pelagianism and Gnosticism. Pelagianism said basically man doesn't need grace, you can do it alone. Right? Gnosticism says if you've got some really secret knowledge, you're really better than others and you'll get up there. And there's a lot of Gnosticism around now, and there's a lot of Pelagianism. And the heresies come back in new forms in every era. And it takes a lot of being canny to kind of see through the era and find them. Paul Witz, I found an extraordinary psychologist in that he could pierce through what you'd call the zeitgeist of the era. He did it in 1960 and 70. I actually emailed Paul Witz and said, did you have anybody to talk to in the Catholic world? Any other Catholic psychologist? And he wrote back saying, no. He said they were all on another wavelength. And he said that basically he ended up talking to a lot of Protestant psychologists who understood what he meant, and they were the ones who encouraged him. And he wrote his first book, the landmark Psychology as Religion, which then sparked off a lot of other psychologists who then started to criticise this Carl Rogers autonomy idea. So that's why we now have quite a body of literature of this critique. But remember, you couldn't get a foot in the door anywhere to say this. So Paul Witz is a very unique, brave individual to have done it in the West, and that's why I go, yay, the Americans,
There's another question. That better be our last question, I think.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Skowronska.
Get used to it.
My question is about the meditation, going back to meditation. I was involved in Melbourne years ago. I had friends who would host a meditation night once a week. And it was Christian meditation, and the mantra was Maranatha. I found it really wonderful, and I'm hoping that there's been no damage done. I don't practice now, I don't do it anymore, but it's in my head that I would like to continue. And I just wondered if you've heard of John Main, and then the Christian meditation newsletter.
Look, I know that there are various groups, and I think that rings a memory, those names. I don't think, if you're saying Maranatha, you're a Catholic, you know what that means. Yeah. You're saying, come Lord Jesus. I mean, I can't see any harm in that. What I'm more concerned about are people who have a shaky grasp of their faith, go to some meditation session, and then they're told to empty the mind. This is a very dangerous state to be in. And there's all kinds of... Look, ask Father Gabriel Amorth. I mean, this is an area too where psychologists have to become involved. We have to become involved in people who have, say, not been well catechised, got involved, and then show some signs of demonic influence. I thought I'd live a life free of ever seeing anybody like this, when one day in my own house a lady came to visit me, and all I said was, guess what, I'm going to a conference on exorcism. That's all I said, having poured a cup of tea. Imagine how you'd feel. The lady started to rock back and forth. I saw her eyeballs. She started to say all kinds of things that I didn't know. And I sat there with my tea cup shaking and put it down quietly and said, thank Michael, please, you know. Because I'm not an expert in this, and I thought, this lady needs a priest. But see, this is the area where a psychologist can discern. You know that the person doesn't need a psychologist, but sometimes the signs are very subtle, as Father Jose Fortea said last year in his talk on exorcism, that sometimes there are very hidden demonic influences, and it takes him months before the demon actually shows itself. So, and he works in collaboration with psychologists and psychiatrists, and Mary Tachinovic and Sister Lydia and I and John Poon were there at this very rare meeting, which was very instructive for us to know the limits of what we can do. But see, the problem is a lot of the mental illnesses can look like demonic possession, and so people say, oh, he's got schizophrenia, he's possessed. No. The problem though arises when you've got a person, say, who might have a mental illness and have some demonic influence. That's a very difficult situation. In any case, you know, I would say no harm was done if you were a Catholic saying a Catholic phrase, to get back to the question. The issue is people who haven't been catechised. Yeah. Getting back to this exorcism conference, the day I turned up, I had swollen gums from a dental appointment. So when I turned up, I thought they might think I need exorcism, because the way I walked in, I'm sort of holding my gums like this, talking like Humphrey Bogart, saying, hello, how are you? But they were very understanding. They probably thought, you're a psychologist.
Thank you, Wanda. Thank you very much, Wanda. Let's give her a big round of applause. Now, this might be a psychological joke. It's very, very light. I wonder if they forgot to put something in it.
I need a box.
It's all yours.